In the dark crypt of the royal palace in Madrid, among silver candelabra and crimson velvet curtains, lies something considered one of the strangest and darkest secrets of European monarchy. It is not a treasure, not a lost crown, and not even the mummified heart of a holy king. It is something much more personal. According to rumors that have been circulating in the corridors of the palace for over 200 years, after the death of King Ferdinand VII in 1833, a certain part of his anatomy was removed from his body and preserved in a glass jar filled with alcohol. We are not talking about internal organs or the brain, but about his manhood. This story, whispered in dark halls and described in banned chronicles, has become one of the most absurd and awkward legends in the history of European monarchies. But could it be true? Was the last symbol of Spanish royal masculinity really preserved in a bottle as some kind of grim trophy? And why, of all the European monarchs, was Ferdinand VII known not for his military victories or political reforms, but for what happened to his genitals? To understand the essence of this strange and gruesome story, one must delve into the life of one of the most controversial and despised Spanish monarchs. Ferdinand VII was not just a king. He was called a coward, a traitor, and a tyrant. Even his own subjects believed that his questionable masculinity had become a symbol of the decline of a once great empire that had lost its former glory forever. Ferdinand was born in 1784 to King Charles IV and Queen Maria Luisa of Parma. At that time, Spain was no longer a powerful maritime empire. The empire was in a state of deep crisis. America had been lost, the fleet had been destroyed by the English, and the economy was in ruins. Revolutionary and then Napoleonic France threatened to take over the entire Iberian Peninsula. From an early age, Ferdinand showed troubling character traits. He was considered cowardly, cunning, and incapable of loyalty. Even as heir to the throne, he plotted against his own father and even wrote secret letters to Napoleon Bonaparte, asking him to help him overthrow Charles IV. This family betrayal was only the first in a long series of betrayals that earned him the nickname the Traitor King. In 1808, after forcing his father to abdicate and taking the throne, Ferdinand remained on the throne for only 2 months. Napoleon, who treated the Spanish royal family like chess pieces, summoned both father and son to Bayonne, France. There, in one of the most humiliating episodes in European monarchy, Ferdinand voluntarily abdicated the Spanish throne in favor of Joseph Bonaparte, Napoleon's brother, in exchange for a French pension and the promise of a castle in France. While the Spanish began a bloody 6-year war with the French invaders, their legitimate king lived in comfort in the castle of Valence, hosting dinner parties, playing musical instruments, and courting the ladies of the French court. This monstrous cowardice was seen by the Spanish as the ultimate betrayal. While partisans were dying in the mountains for their country, Ferdinand ate oysters and drank champagne at the table with his enemies. It was during these years of his gilded exile that the first rumors about his questionable masculinity began to surface. This was even mentioned in diplomatic letters of the time, preserved in French archives. Hints of the Spanish monarch's weakness were not limited to political cowardice. There were also whispers about his physical inadequacy. Some French chroniclers of the time even claimed that Ferdinand might have been impotent, which allegedly explained his willingness to trade the crown for an idle life full of pleasures. When Napoleon was finally defeated in 1814, Ferdinand returned to Spain. But this was not the return of a heroic liberator, but the appearance of a deeply discredited figure. Nevertheless, the people, whether out of naivety or desperation, welcomed him as a beloved figure. This warm welcome was perhaps one of the most serious political misunderstandings in European history. Ferdinand quickly showed that his years in France had not changed him in the slightest. His first decision on the throne was to completely abolish the Constitution of 1812, which had been adopted by the Cortes in Cadiz during his absence. This constitution was considered one of the most progressive liberal documents of its time. Ferdinand restored a cruel, absolute monarchy, began a merciless persecution of all liberals who had fought for the country's independence, and established a reign of terror that would have been the envy of the most brutal despots. But the darkest and most disturbing traits of Ferdinand's character were revealed in his personal life. He married 4 times, and each marriage was accompanied by rumors, scandals, and most importantly, the king's constant inability to produce offspring. Ferdinand's first marriage to Maria Antonia of Naples took place while he was still a prince. Maria Antonia died in 1810 without having given birth to any children. Rumor had it that the marriage had never been consummated. His second marriage, to Isabella of Braganza, daughter of the King of Portugal, took place in 1816. Isabella was renowned for her rare beauty and intelligence, but after 3 years of marriage, they still had no children. Rumors about problems in the couple's intimate life began to circulate in the royal palace once again. His third marriage, to Maria Josefa Amalia of Saxony, proved even more awkward. This woman was determined and pragmatic, and according to rumors, tried every possible way to get pregnant. Doctors were consulted, special prayers were said, pilgrimages were organized, but after 7 years of marriage, there was still no heir. In Europe, people openly mocked the Spanish king, who was unable to fulfill the main duty of a monarch, to ensure the continuation of the dynasty. It was during this period that rumors about Ferdinand's male impotence became particularly vicious and specific. Foreign ambassadors mentioned the Spanish king's difficulties in their diplomatic reports. Satirical pamphlets mocking the king's absence were secretly distributed in Madrid. Some went even further, hinting that he might have been born with anatomical abnormalities or had suffered an illness that damaged his reproductive functions. The situation became so shameful that after the death of Maria Josefa in 1829, the Crown Council literally forced the 45-year-old Ferdinand to remarry. His chosen bride was his niece, Maria Cristina of Bourbon II Habsburg, who was 23 years his junior. This marriage was an act of desperation, the king's last chance not only to produce an heir but also to save his reputation, both political and personal. Unexpectedly, Maria Cristina became pregnant almost immediately. In October 1830, Princess Isabella was born, followed 2 years later by Princess Luisa Fernanda. Finally, after 3 barren marriages, Ferdinand managed to have children. But fate played a cruel joke on him. After decades of fear of not having a male heir, his only children were girls. The birth of the princesses seemed to put an end to rumors about the king's male infertility. However, in reality, this sparked a new wave of gossip. People whispered that the children might not be the king's at all, but the young queen's lovers. Others claimed that Ferdinand had finally found effective medical remedies, or that prayers had worked miracles. The most malicious tongues even said that the king might have used artificial methods of conception, which sounded truly scandalous by the standards of the time. These rumors only served to underscore how badly the monarch's reputation had been damaged. By the end of his reign, Ferdinand had become a pitiful and despised figure. His health was rapidly deteriorating. He suffered from gout, chronic digestive problems, and obesity, which often confined him to bed. His temper, which had always been quick, became completely uncontrollable. He swung between deep bouts of depression and violent outbursts of rage that frightened even those who were accustomed to everything at court. The most disturbing feature of Ferdinand's last years was his obsession with his own masculinity. Medical reports preserved in the royal archives show that he constantly questioned doctors about intimate matters and demanded remedies to enhance his potency and increase his chances of having more children. He took all kinds of potions and elixirs that were supposed to have a stimulating effect, from rhino horn powder to extracts from exotic plants brought from the American colonies. This obsession was directly linked to his growing political paranoia. Ferdinand had always been an insecure king, but towards the end of his life he developed a maniacal conviction that his enemies were threatening not only his power, but also his masculinity. He perceived any criticism not as a debate about the state, but as a personal insult to his masculinity, and responded with a cruelty that shocked even by the standards of the time. In September 1833, Ferdinand fell seriously ill. Doctors diagnosed him with acute gout, kidney problems, and what would today be called severe diabetes. He spent several painful months in his bed in the royal palace, alternating between feverish delusions and frightening moments of clarity when he was clearly aware of his approaching death. It was during this period that Ferdinand made a decision that, according to some historians, was the most memorable act of his entire reign. According to later accounts, the king, obsessed until the end with questions of masculinity and legacy, gave specific instructions regarding the treatment of his body after death. Some sources claim that he himself ordered his genitals to be preserved, allegedly as proof of his true male nature for posterity. When Ferdinand died on September 29, 1833, his body underwent the embalming procedure customary for monarchs of that time: removal of internal organs, treatment with preservatives, and preparation for a state funeral. It was during this process, according to legend, that an episode occurred which gave rise to the most persistent and embarrassing rumor associated with the name of Ferdinand VII. The details vary depending on the source, but the most frequently repeated version says that, on the personal orders of the king or someone close to him, his penis was removed during embalming and preserved separately in a glass jar. Filled with alcohol, this jar was allegedly hidden in the royal family's private archives as a kind of relic of the dynasty's male dignity. This story was first mentioned in written sources in Spanish chronicles of the late 19th century, about 60 years after Ferdinand's death. Historian Benito Pérez Galdós, in his National Episodes, makes a veiled reference to the unusual fate of the remains of the desired one. Other chroniclers of the time, such as Ramón de Mesoneros Romanos, also mention this in their memoirs of the court of Isabella II. The story gained international publicity thanks to the French writer Alexandre Dumas, who, in his travel notes on Spain, recalls hearing about a certain unusual royal relic kept in the Madrid palace. Known for his penchant for sensationalism, Dumas allegedly learned about the last trophy of the Spanish Bourbon dynasty from one of the Spanish nobles, an obvious reference to the alleged organ. In the 20th century, the legend was picked up by various authors and journalists. English writer Gerald Brennan, in his famous book The Spanish Labyrinth, claimed to have heard this story during his stay in Spain in the 1920s. American and French journalists visiting Madrid regularly mention this legend in articles about the royal family. But the most striking thing about this story is not even whether it can be believed, it cannot be proven, but how vividly it reflects the reputation of Ferdinand VII and the spirit of Spanish society in the 19th century. The fact that the legend of the preserved organ lived on for so long, passed down from generation to generation, and becoming more vivid each time, suggests that it expressed something important: how contemporaries and descendants perceived the monarch himself. The obsession with preserving the sexual organ of the deceased king can be seen as the final symbol of a monarchy obsessed with questions of legitimacy and succession, but incapable of solving real problems. Ferdinand VII struggled all his life with rumors about his masculinity and inability to have children, and the idea that even after his death he allegedly tried to prove his masculinity by preserving his organ as material evidence fits perfectly with the logic of his character and obsessions. The legend also reflects the attitude of that era towards the concept of royal masculinity and political power. In a society where a man's ability to produce offspring was directly linked to his right to the throne, a sterile or impotent monarch was not just a personal tragedy, but a threat to the entire state system. In this context, preserving the proof could have been a desperate attempt to retain at least some dynastic legitimacy. In addition, this story demonstrates the cruel but witty folk humor characteristic of the Spanish people. The Spanish people, who had endured a cruel regime during Ferdinand's lifetime, found in this story a way to posthumously mock the monarch they hated. The very fact that the only valuable part of the king was supposedly recognized as that which had been the subject of humiliating rumors throughout his life seems like a sophisticated form of popular revenge. From a historical point of view, it is important to note that no physical evidence of the existence of this relic has ever been found. No official inventory of the Spanish royal archives mentions such an item. Even in the 20th century, when many royal secrets became public knowledge, no reliable clues or confirmation of the existence of the mysterious jar were found. The archives of the Spanish royal house claim that they have never found a single document confirming this story. Similarly, none of the subsequent Spanish monarchs ever mentioned the alleged relic, which would have been expected if it had actually existed and been of significance to the dynasty. However, the lack of evidence has not weakened the power of the legend. On the contrary, the inability to either confirm or refute it has only strengthened its appeal. The legend of Ferdinand VII's preserved organ became more than just a historical episode. It became part of cultural folklore. During the Spanish Civil War and the subsequent Franco dictatorship, this story took on new political significance. Republicans and communists used it as a symbol of the degradation and absurdity of the monarchy, while monarchists tried to silence or refute it. Franco himself, obsessed with themes of male power and authority, allegedly hated any mention of this story and tried to remove it from official history textbooks. Paradoxically, it was during the democratic period that followed Franco's death that the legend gained a second life. Historians and journalists, now free to explore previously forbidden topics, rediscovered and popularized the story. History books for the general public, television programs, and even films began to mention the legend, securing its place in the country's cultural memory. The continuing relevance of this story also reflects changes in public perceptions of sexuality and power in the 21st century. The idea of a king so obsessed with his own masculinity that he decided to preserve his genitals after death is now seen not just as strange, but as deeply pathological. This shift in perception has transformed Ferdinand VII from a perhaps tragic figure into a truly grotesque character. From a psychological point of view, the legend offers an interesting insight into the nature of absolute power and its distortions. Ferdinand VII became an example of what happens when a person with unlimited power develops personal obsessions, because such ideas inevitably become matters of state importance. His obsession with his own masculinity was not just personal insecurity. It directly influenced Spain's foreign and domestic policy. The difference is particularly striking when compared to other European monarchs of the time. For example, Louis XIII of France, a contemporary of Ferdinand, also faced suspicions about his sexuality and ability to have children. But he managed to maintain his dignity as a monarch and did not become the hero of such humiliating legends. It is likely that, despite his weaknesses, Louis was respected for his intelligence and political skill, while Ferdinand was almost universally despised for his cowardice and betrayal. The story of the alleged relic clearly shows how the monarchies of the 19th century tried to cope with social and political changes that were making their traditions and power increasingly obsolete. Ferdinand's obsession with proving his physical masculinity was, in essence, an instinctive reaction to a subconscious awareness that the very idea of monarchical power was being fundamentally questioned. From the point of view of historical legacy, the legend achieved what none of Ferdinand's real policies could. It made him truly memorable. While his reforms, military decisions, and economic policies are known only to a narrow circle of specialists, the story of his supposedly preserved organ is known to anyone with even a passing interest in Spanish history. And therein lies the final bitter irony. The fact that a king who devoted his life to caring for his reputation and legacy is remembered primarily for a humiliating legend about his genitals is perhaps the cruelest form of historical retribution. Ferdinand VII dreamed of going down in history as a great absolute monarch, but he is remembered as the man whose genitals were allegedly preserved in a jar. This legend is a grim reminder of how fragile royal honor is, and how quickly greatness can turn into ridicule. Ferdinand died confident that he had restored absolutism in Spain and secured the future of the Bourbon dynasty. But in reality, his daughter Isabella was overthrown by a revolution just 35 years after his death, and the Spanish monarchy went through one existential crisis after another throughout the 20th century. Today, almost 2 centuries after Ferdinand's death, the story of his supposedly preserved organ lives on. It is retold on the internet, in popular documentaries, and in books on alternative history. It has become a permanent part of European royal mythology, alongside the legend of the Romanovs' hemophilia, the madness of George III, and other similar stories. Whether Ferdinand's organ was actually preserved, we will probably never know. The Spanish royal archives keep their secrets, and many documents were lost or destroyed during the political upheavals of the 19th and 20th centuries. But perhaps the actual truth is not as important here as the symbolic one. The story of the king with the most scandalous organ in Europe is, in essence, a parable about power, masculinity, and the futility of human pride. Ferdinand VII spent his entire life trying to prove that he was strong and worthy, and in the end, he became a laughingstock for posterity. If his organ had really been preserved in glass, it would have been nothing more than a physical embodiment of a life spent on empty obsessions and senseless cruelty. The legend of Ferdinand VII reminds us that history can take cruel revenge on those who are too preoccupied with their own glory. The king who feared ridicule for his incompetence most of all became exactly what he feared becoming. Not because his body parts ended up in a jar, but because his character and actions exposed an inner emptiness that no outward display of bravery could conceal. History cannot be embalmed. It will always find a way to tell the truth about those who tried to